That forest had a bad reputation. The locals called it the Black Heart, and even the bravest hunters avoided it. The old folks said there was something wrong with it. Something beyond logic. Something that was waiting. Mark never believed in scary tales. He was a practical man, trusting only what he could see or feel. So when his friend Daniel suggested a hiking trip to the Black Heart, Mark agreed without hesitation. What could go wrong, he thought. The first few hours were ordinary. The forest looked like any other, dense trees, birds chirping, fresh air. But the deeper they went, the more uncertain Mark began to feel. The air grew heavy, as if the forest was trying to push them out. The trees seemed to stand closer together, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy that barely let the sunlight through. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" Mark asked as they stopped to rest. Daniel nodded, but his face was tense. He pulled out the map, but even it seemed strange. The lines that had once been clear now looked blurry, as if someone had deliberately distorted them. "This is weird," Daniel muttered. "We should have reached the stream by now." A chill ran down Mark's spine. He glanced at his watch, but the hands had stopped. Even the compass Daniel brought spun aimlessly, refusing to point in any direction. "Maybe we should turn back," Mark suggested, but Daniel shook his head. "No, we've come too far. We'll find a way out." They continued forward, but the forest seemed to change before their eyes. The trees grew taller, their bark darker. The air filled with the scent of rot, something unnatural. Strange tracks appeared on the ground, not animal prints, but footprints. Human-like, yet too large, as if they belonged to a creature that shouldn't exist. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered when they stumbled upon the first doll. It hung from a branch, made of twigs and moss. Its face was crudely carved, yet eerily lifelike, making Mark's heart skip a beat. The doll's eyes, made of small stones, seemed almost alive, watching them. "Just someone playing a prank," Daniel said, but his voice trembled. "Let's keep going." But the dolls multiplied. They hung from every tree, their empty eyes following every step. The air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. Mark felt watched, as if unseen eyes were tracking their every move. He tried not to look at the dolls, but their gaze felt inescapable. By nightfall, they decided to set up camp. The fire barely flickered, as if the forest refused to allow light. Mark sat hugging his knees, trying not to think about what might be lurking in the dark. Daniel attempted to joke, but his laughter sounded forced. "Did you hear that?" Mark whispered suddenly. Daniel froze. A rustling sound came from the darkness. Faint at first, then growing louder. As if something large was approaching them. The fire flickered, and in its glow, Mark saw something that made his blood run cold. A figure stood among the trees. Too tall, too thin. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Mark could feel its gaze on him. Its arms were unnaturally long, nearly touching the ground, and its fingers ended in sharp claws. "Run!" Daniel roared, and they bolted into the night. The forest became a maze. The trees seemed to shift, blocking their path. The ground was wet beneath their feet, as if the forest itself was crying. Mark could hear something massive moving behind them, its breath hot and heavy. He tried to run faster, but his legs sank into the mud, branches slashing at his face. When he finally stopped, Daniel was gone. Mark was alone. Around him, the forest pulsed with life of its own. Whispers rose from the darkness, the trees speaking in a language he couldn't understand. The words filled him with dread. Mark knew he wouldn't escape. The forest wouldn't let him go. He was part of the Black Heart now. And he knew that something was coming for him. Something that had been waiting all along. Mark stood among the trees, his heart pounding as if it wanted to burst out of his chest. The darkness was so thick that he couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. The air was cold and heavy, as if the forest itself was trying to suffocate him. He called out for Daniel, but there was no response. Only the echo of his voice, bouncing off the trees, mocking him. "Daniel," he shouted again, but the only reply was the rustling of branches. Mark tried to calm himself. He knew that panic would only make things worse. He took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts. "I need to find my way back," he thought. But how? The forest looked the same in every direction. Trees, bushes, shadows, everything blended into a single, faceless mass. He decided to move in the direction he thought they had come from. Step by step, he pushed through the undergrowth, but each meter was a struggle. Branches clawed at his clothes, as if trying to hold him back. The ground beneath his feet was wet and slippery, and more than once, he nearly fell. After a while, Mark heard a sound. It was a faint tapping, as if someone was knocking a stick against a tree. He stopped, listening. The tapping repeated, and Mark realized it was coming from the left. He cautiously moved in that direction, hoping it was Daniel. But as he got closer, the tapping suddenly stopped. Instead, he heard a whisper. A soft, barely audible voice that spoke his name. "Mark," the forest whispered. He froze. It couldn't be Daniel. The voice was too thin, too unnatural. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He turned, but there was no one there. Just the trees, standing still, watching. "Who's there?" he whispered, but there was no answer. Mark decided to ignore the voice. He knew it could be just his mind playing tricks on him, fueled by fear and exhaustion. He kept walking, but now he felt something following him. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. Something large. Something inhuman. When he finally stumbled into a small clearing, his eyes locked onto something that made his heart stop. Lying on the ground was Daniel's jacket. It was torn, as if shredded by massive claws. Next to it were footprints, but not human ones. They were too big, too deep. "Daniel," Mark whispered, trying to keep his fear at bay. He stepped closer and saw something that made him recoil. Carved into the tree above the jacket was a symbol. A circle with interwoven lines, resembling a spider's web. It looked ancient, as if it had been there for years, yet at the same time, it seemed alive, the lines shifting in the darkness. Something touched his shoulder. Mark spun around, but there was nothing. Just the forest, still and silent. But now, he felt it, something had changed. The air grew colder, and the whispering voices became louder. "You won't leave," one of them murmured. Mark ran. He didn't know where, only that he had to move. His legs carried him through the thickening woods, but the forest didn't want to let him go. The trees grew denser, branches whipping his face, but he didn't stop. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, he found himself by a stream. The water was clear and cold, offering a brief moment of relief. He scooped some into his hands and drank, trying to soothe his dry throat. But when he looked up, he saw something that made him scream. On the opposite bank stood a figure. It was a woman, but her face was distorted, as if carved from wood. Her eyes were hollow, yet they stared directly at him. She didn't move, just stood there, waiting. Mark scrambled to his feet and ran in the opposite direction. He didn't know what she was, but he didn't want to find out. The forest grew even denser, but he kept running, never looking back. He could hear something following him, but he couldn't see it. Only the sound of heavy footsteps and breathing, too deep to be human. When he finally collapsed onto the ground, he felt something grab his leg. He screamed, but no one could hear him. The forest was silent, as if holding its breath. Mark felt himself being dragged into the darkness, and in his last moment, he saw the wooden woman's face. She was smiling. Mark woke up to a sharp pain in his head. He lay on the ground, surrounded by a thick fog that coiled around him like a living creature. His leg, the one that had been grabbed, was scraped, but the wound seemed superficial. He couldn't understand how he had survived, but that was now the least of his problems. The forest around him had changed. The trees were even taller, their bark darker, and their branches twisted like hands reaching for him. The air was so dense that every breath was a struggle. Mark knew he couldn't stay here. He had to find a way out. He pushed himself up, feeling every muscle in his body ache. His leg throbbed, but he knew he had to keep moving. He stepped forward cautiously, trying not to make unnecessary noise. The forest was silent, but the silence was just as terrifying as any sound. It reminded him that he was not alone. After some time, he stumbled upon a path. It was narrow and barely visible, but it was a sign. Someone or something had passed through here before. Mark decided to follow it, hoping it would lead him out of the woods. The path took him deeper into the forest, but he had no choice. Every step was heavy, but he knew he had to continue. Eventually, he emerged into a clearing that looked familiar. It was the same place where he had found Daniel's jacket. But now, there was something else. A body lay on the ground. It was Daniel. His face was pale, his eyes wide open as if he had died in terror. Around him were footprints, but they weren't from an animal. They looked human, too large, too deep. Tears welled up in Mark's eyes. He knew Daniel was dead, but he couldn't accept it. He knelt down to get a closer look, but suddenly, he heard a sound. It wasn't the rustling of branches. It was a voice. "You shouldn't have come here," it whispered. Mark turned around and saw her. The woman from the tree. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her face distorted, but now he could see the details. Her eyes were empty, yet filled with sorrow. She wasn't terrifying. She was tragic. "Who are you?" Mark whispered. "I am the spirit of the forest," she replied. "I guard this place. But you disturb the peace." Mark felt his heart stop. He knew she was right. He shouldn't have come here. But now it was too late. "I didn't mean to," he started, but she interrupted him. "You cannot leave. The forest won't let you. You are now part of it." Mark felt something wrap around his leg. He looked down and saw the roots of the trees twisting around him like living creatures. He struggled to break free, but it was useless. The roots were pulling him down into the earth. "Please," he whispered, but the woman only watched him. "You will be here forever," she said. "Just like me. Just like everyone who came before." Mark felt the earth close over his eyes. The last thing he saw was the face of the woman from the tree. She was smiling, but in her eyes, there was sadness. The forest remained silent. The trees stood still, as if nothing had happened. But if you look closely, you'll notice something strange. Among the trees, there is one that looks different. Its bark resembles a face, and its branches stretch like hands. And if you listen carefully, you can hear a whisper. It's Mark's voice. The forest never lets go. Jack Devereaux worked as a truck driver. Over the past 15 years, he had seen it all: accidents, drunk travelers, wild animals on the road. But never had he felt fear like he did that night. His route took him through a desolate forest in northern Maine. The road was in poor condition, cell service was nearly non-existent, and the headlights barely cut through the thick fog hanging between the tall pines. Hour after hour, mile after mile, he pushed through the deserted woods. Suddenly, his headlights caught a figure on the roadside. A woman. She stood there, wrapped in something dark, her hair disheveled, her face half hidden in shadow. Jack eased off the gas. The woman didn't wave, didn't signal for help, she just stood there, staring. "Damn," he muttered and pressed the pedal, swerving around her. He tried to shake the image from his mind, but a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. A few miles later, again. She was there. The same woman. Jack cursed under his breath but didn't stop. 10 minutes later, she appeared a third time. This time, Her head was tilted slightly, and her lips curved into a faint smile. His breath caught in his throat. This was impossible. Jack slammed his foot on the gas, speeding down the road, ignoring the potholes. He refused to look in the mirrors, refused to check if she was now behind him. Then something happened. The engine died. The lights went out. Silence. He sat there, desperately turning the key, but it just spun uselessly. Slowly, Jack lifted his eyes to the windshield. The woman stood directly in front of the truck. And this time, her smile was wider. Jack froze. He felt cold sweat trickle down his spine. The woman stood right in front of the truck, her dark figure illuminated by the faint glow of the hazard lights. Her face was half hidden in shadow, but the smile. It was unnaturally wide, almost predatory. His fingers trembled as he tried the ignition again. The key turned, but the engine didn't even sputter. The woman took a step forward. Jack instinctively reached for the door handle, intending to lock the doors, but then realized how pointless that was. He was in the truck. She was outside. But something told him that wasn't enough. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying his reaction. Then, she took another step. Jack looked around in panic. The forest was pitch black, the tree branches swaying in the wind, but there were no voices, no sounds, just his own heavy breathing. He slammed his hand against the horn. The blaring noise shattered the silence, making him flinch. But the woman didn't even blink. And then she vanished. Simply dissolved into thin air. Jack blinked, disbelief washing over him. She was there. He had seen her. A soft tapping came from the left side. Jack whipped his head around. She was standing by his door. Her lips no longer curled into a smile. They were pressed tightly together. But her eyes. They were empty. Jack recoiled, pressing his back against the seat. His fingers fumbled toward the glove compartment. There had to be a knife in there. The tapping came again. Once. Twice. 3 times. He grabbed the knife and clenched it tightly in his hand. The woman leaned closer to the window. Her lips barely moved. Open. Jack didn't hear it with his ears. He heard it inside his head. His fingers moved toward the door handle on their own. At the last moment, realization slammed into him, and he clenched his hand into a fist, jerking it away. "Fuck," he gasped, shrinking back. The woman went still. Then, her mouth stretched into that awful smile again. She raised a finger to her lips. Shoo. And vanished. The engine roared to life on its own. The headlights flickered back on. Jack didn't wait to question it. He stomped on the gas so hard the tires screeched against the wet road. The truck barreled through the night, trees looming on either side, their branches seeming to reach for him like living things. Jack was too afraid to check the mirrors, but instinct forced him to steal a quick glance. And he regretted it instantly. Reflected in the rearview mirror, sitting in the passenger seat, was her. Her empty eyes stared straight at him. "I asked you to open," she whispered. Jack never managed to scream. Jack's lungs tightened with fear. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and his heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. The woman sat beside him, her body swaying slightly with the motion of the truck, but her face remained eerily still. Empty eyes, lifeless skin, a smile that seemed to be growing wider. "Get out," he whispered to himself, having no idea who he was even speaking to. The truck sped forward, cutting through the dense forest. The headlights illuminated the winding road, but the faster he drove, the more endless it seemed. "Where's the road?" Jack rasped. The woman slowly tilted her head, never breaking eye contact. "You're not where you were." A cold dread gripped Jack's body. He forced himself to look at the speedometer. The needle was frozen. The sensation of movement was gone. He wasn't driving anymore. He was somewhere. What did you do? His voice was weak, almost muffled. The woman raised her hand and gently placed it over his, which still clutched the wheel. Her cold, dead skin burned against his. "Don't be afraid, Jack," she murmured. "You're one of us now." His eyes widened. "One of us." She nodded toward the side. Jack turned his head. The forest. It was different now. The trees were taller, their trunks twisted into unnatural shapes as if they were knotting together. The leaves were unnaturally still, despite the wind that hadn't stopped. And among the trees stood figures. Hundreds of them. Women. Men. Children. All with the same eerie smile. The same empty eyes. Waiting. No. Jack shook his head, gripping the wheel tighter. But his fingers. They no longer obeyed him. He looked down. His skin had turned gray. He could no longer feel his heartbeat. And in the rearview mirror, he saw his own reflection. Empty eyes. A smile. Part of him wanted to scream. Another part simply waited. The forest had claimed him. He was one of them now.